welcome back to the Beer Ladies podcast. I am your host for today, Christina, and I am joined with Katie, Lisa, and Erica. Say hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Today we are asking the perennial question, what is the oldest pub in Ireland? If we can even answer that, we will find out throughout the episode. Before we get into it though, just a reminder to please check us out on all of the socials and make sure that you follow us on YouTube. And we have merch, so do check out our merch. And if you're interested, please buy us a coffee. We do appreciate everything that you all do for us. Thank you so much to everyone who has helped us and supported us so far. So before we kick off, Erica, what are you drinking?
Well, I have brought this straight from work. It is called Alma from Whiplash Beer, and it's a wit beer. Just showing the art to the camera. Yeah.
Ooh, and does that mean that they have just brewed another batch of Alma?
I suppose it does.
Okay.
It'll probably be announced on our socials and available on the website by the time this episode airs. Yeah. And a fun side note, I think one of the first times that I ever met Lisa in person and caught up with Katie in person was almost exactly a year ago, and that was one of the beers that we were drinking.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yes. It was very hot that day for Ireland. I mean,
and it was COVID restrictions, outdoor drinks only. Yeah.
Yes.
Bring your own. Very good. Anyway. So I am drinking a very new to me brewery. It's River Shannon Brewing, and it's Martello Tower IPA. And for those on YouTube, I'm going to see if you can see the can. There's like, what is that symbol called? The Trinity thing?
The knot.
The Trinity knot.
Yeah.
Is on it, IPA. And that's what it looks like.
It's a lovely color, sort of a coppery kind of a thing. Ooh.
And are they out of Offaly? Are they formerly Slave Bloom or?
I don't think they're formerly Slave Bloom. I think they have a different name. Let me read it. They're from Banagher. It just says, does it say they're from Banagher? No. The Martello Tower is from Banagher.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've met them. Yeah, I've met them. I met them at Ballykilcavin hop picking, where they were saying they were just getting ready to launch, and obviously COVID had taken, made that much more difficult than had been. But I know this has been coming for a while. I believe they have a red ale as well. I have yet to try them, but they were lovely guys. So hopefully it's all good.
It is actually. It is Banagher, Church Street, Kylebeg, Banagher, County Offaly. So yeah, it tastes really nice, and it's good to see new breweries coming on stream. And I got that I popped into Tyrrellstown to the home of the beer club. They had lots of really interesting beers, so I was like, I haven't tried that one before, I'll try you. So there we go. I might be having another one, I think.
Wonderful. And I guess I'll share. I have a new, or at least new to me, beer from Third Barrel, Some Dance to Remember Extra Pale Ale. I know there was a little back and forth over what does extra pale mean on Irish Beer Twitter this week, but I have to say this is really, it says, crisp and fruit forward, and they're not wrong about that, but it's really lovely and lovely and sort of biscuity as well. So it's 4.8, so clocks in at a good but not crazy strength. But I don't know if it's as fresh as that Alma, but it tastes really, really fresh. So I think these have just appeared in shops, it seems. So really enjoying this.
Yeah, and that is not the first extra pale ale we've had. I think that was on tap in Beer Temple when we were there.
Really
tasty.
I had that at the Rascals Festival, and looking at the lineup for the Franciscan Well Festival that I'm going to the day after we're recording, which is tomorrow, they have Some Dance to Forget, which is at 10%.
Yeah, I love. I mean, I'm always here for a sort of not gimmicky name but funny name. So I like that they've got the two beers together. That's great.
Yeah, I totally think puns are an art form, definitely, and I'm there for them. I love them. I go all in.
Now, Christina, what are you drinking?
Okay, so actually, Sarah from podcast, of course, works at Rye River, and so they sent me some beer, and this lovely postcard with they've changed the names of some of the beers, but the recipe still stays the same. So I'm drinking the Backwaters American Wheat.
I had that when I was watching Eurovision. That's lovely.
It's really nice.
Really nice for this warmish weather. Yeah.
Yeah. It's hot for me today, these past couple days. So this is a really good hot weather beer. So thank you to Rye River for sending this to me. And I do genuinely like this beer, and I liked it and its old name, and I like it in its new name. And yes, I just like this beer. So very happy. And I'm not drinking out of glass because why not?
Sorry, you're saving water by not having to wash up. It's good, better for the environment. There we go.
It's not because I'm lazy.
No, we don't say that. We're saving the world.
Here. You're doing your bit.
So, ladies, this episode is all about Ireland's oldest pub.
Dun, dun, dun.
And I know that the historians amongst us are like, oh my God, this is such a divisive topic. So I don't know. I will say, so I was on my wedding anniversary. We went down to Kilkenny and we were in a pub there called Kittler's. Have you heard of it?
Yes.
Been there? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I love the witch story, by the way.
Story. I think they were doing some heavy lifting too, but yes.
Very heavy lifting. Very heavy lifting. Yes, she was married 4 times. All her husbands died when they were very wealthy and left all the money to her. So she must be the witch. Anyway, they were saying it was founded in 1324, or it's been there since 1324. So I am like, ladies, people who know far more than me, what is Ireland's oldest pub, and what makes Ireland's oldest pub its oldest pub?
Right. So I'm gonna speak in generalizations for reasons. And I'm gonna start by saying that the question itself is problematic. And I will explain why. And Lisa will chime in as well on why. So basically, what is Ireland's oldest pub is using the term pub, which of course comes from public house. And that term doesn't, from my research, so someone please correct me but what I have found is that term doesn't really come into play much until the end of the 17th century. So if you're asking what the oldest public house is, then we're going to have to find something that defined itself by that term, because this term also existed alongside other terms like tavern and alehouse. So it wasn't just the 17th century and everything's now a public house.
Right.
That's not quite how it worked, right? So it was gradual, and then it picked up, and then you'd have to find something that self-identifies as a public house, and the earliest example of that, but that's still limiting you to maybe at the end of the 17th century, probably at the earliest, right? So that's not actually the question I think people want answered. I think the question people really want answered is, what is the oldest place that I could buy a beer and drink it on premise? Right? I think that's the question.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. I would agree, because I think when you start talking about licensing laws and things like that, and even though obviously at times you have, we'll say, a sort of shared political landscape, I'll put it that way, with the sort of the licensing that you have in Britain, it changes over time, but we don't really get a licensing law in Ireland until 1635, and then it gets repealed, and then there's another one, but it's very specific about, kind of what it's defining there. And that doesn't mean that there were no pubs or no drinking establishments, let's say. Certainly before 1635, there absolutely were. But I think it's interesting that's, if you're looking for things that have a paper trail, you're not going to really find much before that with that kind of specific documentation. So it's again, it's like, which question are you answering? So. Yeah.
And that causes problems. And so then I think the other part of it is that you're probably also wanting to know what has still been in continuous use, because I could sit here and tell you where there were taverns in the medieval period.
Absolutely.
We have a whole entire street. It's called Tavern Street, sometimes Wine Tavern Street, which is what you know it as now, but
Yeah.
Tavern Street. And they would have sold ale, also wine. So literally there, but they don't exist anymore. I could also tell you that the fairgrounds outside of the city walls, the old medieval fairgrounds, could have been a place where you could have bought and drank ale in public. But they're not there anymore, right? So
Yeah.
I think the other layer of it is continuous use, but also continuous use as a drinking establishment. Because, for example, Gillian Kenny, in her study of women in Ireland, in 1423, she came across a woman called Juliana Loverin, who was a widow, and her alongside a John Waring, who was a merchant. They leased 2 cellars under Christ Church, and cellars under churches could have been used as taverns. And so Kenny has suggested that this possibly could have been used as a tavern. Possibly. This is a possibility. Yeah. This is not a definite, don't run with this. But I think, Kenny's making an interesting and sound argument here that I think adds a layer, but we're not still using that. It wasn't in continuous use as that. So yeah, that's out, right? But it's interesting. It's interesting. And then, of course, the people were brewing in Dublin Castle, and we know they were brewing other places in Christchurch. We have an idea that there were a couple breweries, like these kinds of things. So what kind of spaces are we looking for when we're looking at medieval names? Or medieval public ale drinking, buying places. And see, this is where things get a little difficult, because ale houses could be temporary spaces. They could literally be part of someone's house, which they were. Yeah. I'm not saying they could be, they were. Not all the time, but yeah. Anyway, they were. And they could be temporary. Like, you could literally say, okay, I have ale to sell and I'm selling it here, or I'm selling it to go. There were lots of options. So permanent space, not permanent space, these things get a little fuzzy. And then there's inns, which sometimes have a really strict definition, and then sometimes it seems to be a little bit different. So, for example, there was something in medieval Dublin called the Tobel, which was a portion of ale that the brewers of Dublin had to give to one of the local churches, as just part of what they had to do. It was passed by John of England in 1185. But we know that this becomes a problem, because in 1308, there's a legal case taken out against the brewers in Dublin, who are apparently not giving their amount.
No, it's always the way you hear about it in the legal case. That's the thing.
So there we have an idea. And we have an idea that inns are exempt from this, which tells us that maybe inns are brewing, but they don't have to pay this. So an inn could be a place where you could be in public, brewed ale, sold it, these kinds of things. But we also have 25 names of people who were brewing. So I could tell you, out of the 25 names, 5 or 7, I don't remember off the top of my head, were women. That doesn't mean the rest. That doesn't mean the rest weren't also women. It just who might have been represented by their husbands for legal reasons. Yeah. Maybe not. Maybe there's Anyway, there's lots of layers to that, but we do know that there were taverns that were brewing from that, and then of course ale houses, brewers, these sorts of things. So that adds another layer, but we don't know where any of those people were brewing, right? Yes.
So we just have their names really from that. We don't have like a premises or a location where anything was done, or.
No, we basically just have their names. And
okay.
Again, like, I'm going to moan about this, but the 1922 fire did destroy a lot of stuff. And I'm really excited because of the new project.
Yes.
That has, oh my gosh, that is going to put together thousands, I think they said hundreds of documents that were burned in that fire, and they've tried to reconstruct them all. So I think I cannot wait to get my hands on that. I think that's going to really hopefully add a lot to my book on Irish beer history. So I really can't wait to see those and what those say, because that might change a lot of things. Hopefully we get some really fascinating stuff out of that. So, but what I'm going with is what I can tell you about now. And this kind of persists later on. So Barnaby Rich's diatribe in 1610, A New Description of Ireland, he talks about taverns and alehouses. These are both places where you can purchase ale. And he kind of is very snarky about alehouses and how the alehouse keepers think that they have taverns, but they really aren't. They're just alehouse keepers. So
he's looking down his nose at the alehouse keepers going,
yeah,
oh.
well, he has a lot of nasty things to say. And he actually, he had to write an apology a couple years later because he managed to piss off everybody. And yeah, so he not a beloved person in Dublin. So we have this idea of, this ale houses and taverns as these kind of places. But again, where are they?
Right.
Is a whole nother question. And yeah.
And I think a lot of the street names in Dublin, from what I understand, have changed based on politics. So like that might be tricky as well, like geographically, when you're looking back for the written records, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, like city center, we have a lot of really awesome medievalists have come through and made maps of what the old city was, and we have a pretty good idea of the old cities. Not that the streets names haven't changed, but we know where the old streets would have been. Wine Tavern Street's Wine Tavern Street, Bridge Street is Bridge Street, Cook Street is Cook Street. These kinds of things. We have an idea of where everything is, but yeah, a lot of times these people don't come up in records unless they're running afoul from it, where they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. They're getting fined, they're operating illegally, they're not paying their toll bill. These are where we find them, because brewing, of course, is quite ubiquitous for a lot of people as part of just, their daily activities. So they're not popping up as much until we have later cases, at the end of the 17th century, where, for example, we see a list of brewers being published, common brewers, because the army was stealing their horses and they wanted to dictate that they should be protected from these horse thefts. And so they published a list of all the brewers and the amount of horses they were allowed to have, and were basically like, you can't steal them. This also amounts to the brewers that were big enough to have horses and all that other stuff. So that's when we start to see things, but then it's generally still a street or a general region. Like we also have cess records, weekly cess or water charges, but again, it's like a street name. So it's like St. Patrick Street, Kevin Street, Cook Street. I can tell you that there were brewers on these based on the cess records, on the water records. I can tell you that they are, but I couldn't tell you where they were.
Sure.
What are cess records for the?
Yeah.
It was grinding, malt. It was a payment.
Oh, okay.
It was like it was a tax. It was raising money for something.
And I think your points about definitions and being continuously run are very important, because those are things that people are thinking about when they look to this evidence. And perhaps like the names of the pubs or drinking establishments would have changed as well.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna kind of get into that now. I think might as well, about the issues with using archaeology to determine what the oldest pub in Ireland or literally anywhere is, because the archaeology doesn't necessarily tell you of continuous use or what it was originally. We can speculate, right? So we can say, for example, in Lichfield, Kirsty Nicol, who was the site director of this particular place in Lichfield, she found many jugs and a large toilet in this particular dig site. And so it led them to conclude that this might have been an inn, given the amount of like pitchers and jugs and things like that. So you can look at those things and say, okay, given the amount and this, maybe it's this. But the problem is, if you dig under your site and you just find jugs and maybe things that say that this at some point there was some kind of habituation, a house or something there, that doesn't mean that it was a pub. That doesn't mean it was an inn. It doesn't mean, just because there was some kind of something there doesn't mean it was your something. And it doesn't mean it was in continuous use. And yeah, so it kind of gets a little problematic, you know, because there would also have to be evidence like the Litchfield site that leads you to indicate that this was an inn or an ale house that was, but then we go into, well, it could have been someone's house who sold ale, and then that becomes problematic. And so it's just, it's a little fuzzy, right?
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying too that it's also kind of hard to compare some of these things, like what you see in Ireland versus what you see in England as well, just because the pattern of urbanization is so different, where in Ireland you have so many monastic settlements, and we know that there was monastic brewing going on all over the place, but the pattern of you know, compared to that, say in England or even somewhere like Germany, where, you know, you certainly have monastic brewing too, where then there they tended to evolve more quickly, if you like, again, in air quotes, into kind of more urban centers where this is a commercial activity. In Ireland, a lot of them are still basically church owned, if you like. So is it even commercial? Again, it's hard to say if it's the same kind of, like, is it expressing the same thing, even if they are essentially brewing and consuming ale on the same scale. And I did a really interesting walking tour the other week of all around Grange Gorman and the TUD campus, where there are just amazing old buildings. But the again, going back to Christchurch, like, that's where all of their malting was happening. A lot of their brewing was happening there, where they had people just doing that for them. And do we count that as kind of a commercial activity? And again, this is, you know, we're talking sort of 13th through kind of 13th, 14th century, that kind of thing. But it's like, well, one, it's not there now, so we can't point to continuous use. But two, it's just like, it's very different from how we see this in other places. So I think, I know there's a lot of work going on now where people are saying, oh, what's the oldest pub in England, or, you know, in maybe sort of England and Wales. And it's a different question to answer there too, just because they're different kinds of establishments, even if they look kind of very broadly similar. So again, to your point, Christina, about the archaeology, is like, it can tell us certain things, but even things that look alike are not necessarily saying the same thing. So it's hard.
Just to jump in, and the idea that there are places that you can stay that you didn't have to pay for ale or food, but it was still part of a hosting duty. So does that count somehow as this public space? Because
exactly.
they were places for travelers. And so, like, you know, when we're looking at the records of Christchurch, the prior is hosting lots of people. And, you know, we know that there was a brewery like really close to where the Christchurch actual site is. There was definitely one near there. And then there's some arguments. There was one closer into the early modern period, a bit on that hill, like right where Dublinia is. But of course they're not there anymore. But, you know, when we're hosting people, like, is that a house party? But not quite, right? So there's lots of layers to understanding the idea of public drinking in a medieval or early modern context is a bit different to our modern understandings of what drinking in public might look like. And so those definitions need to be taken into account, exactly like Lisa said. Like, how are we considering public drinking, and are we inflicting our modern ideas of what that looks like onto the past? And should we? Is this a fair question to ask? You know, sorry, Erica, what were you saying?
Oh no, just that you know, when we were talking about this episode, I thought, this is cut and dry, this is black and white. Like, the oldest superlative should be objective, and finding that proof is a lot tougher than I thought it would be. So I appreciate your expertise when it comes to the history side of this, because a lot of this is just something that I think particularly people from a country so young as ours, the US, maybe take for granted or don't understand. in terms of like, okay, like I believe what you're telling me on your t-shirt, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because like the problem is if we're just doing it like archaeologically, for example, with not combining the history and not looking at continuous use. I could go out conceivably, build a pub on Wine Tavern Street, and tomorrow say I have one of the oldest pubs in Dublin, because there is probably evidence somewhere underneath of there of a tavern or a pub that existed at some point in time. But that's not how this works.
But you could still claim it, and you could legitimately, in a way, claim it. And
you could absolutely say, I mean, I think it would be cool if you said, like, listen, this street was home to taverns back in the day. Now ours is obviously not continuous use, but hey, we're continuing a legacy of something. And I think that's really cool. But I think language matters, and we need to be specific when we're saying things.
Yes.
Although also great business opportunity if someone did have something where, say, you showed the archaeology underneath, did a whole Jorvik Viking Center kind of a thing, just saying it's there, you could do it. So anyway,
like that
would be
the little,
amazing.
like
Yes!
the little, yes,
That would be cool. And I think it would be really cool if places did do that. Like I'm absolutely here for saying, okay, there was some kind of a settlement here. Come look, isn't this cool?
Absolutely.
And for any tourists to Ireland, there is a little around Christchurch, isn't it? And it has actually, when they were building it, they decided to put a glass panel on the floor so you can see down and you can see the layers of history beneath you.
Yeah, it's the old theater there. It's very cool. Do recommend, and then you can, pick up some pretzels. It's all good.
No, but I think maybe some of the plaques or advertisements might be misleading to people who don't have the correct information.
I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole because I don't want to get sued.
But
everyone is very careful with their definitions. We'll put it that way.
For example, like I've been to the largest ball of twine by a singular person in Darwin, Minnesota, and like I do not doubt that fact. Like I saw it, I took the photos, I read about it, but this is a lot more complicated,
Yeah. It's really complicated. And I think when we go back the oldest, we're really talking about these ale houses, taverns. These could be more temporary spaces, but like, the Dublin Wine Street Commission knocked down a lot of these buildings. We don't really have old buildings. Well, as a medievalist, super, super old,
right.
So, and then it becomes, because I saw this conversation on Twitter, and someone, I forget who, said it's basically like the ship of Theseus. Like, at what point does this still that building if after you've removed so many pieces of it? And I think, if the foundations are there, the foundations are there. And if you can identify that historically it's been in continuous use, then I think you can say something.
Yeah. It's like the only fools and horses sweeping brush, isn't it?
Yes, it's exactly the same. Yeah,
it's exactly the same. It's had what, like, I don't know, 5 heads and two bowls, but it's the same sweeping brush, right?
Exactly. Oh gosh, and now there's a musical in the West End. That's aside.
Yeah, so I think there's all these things about temporary versus permanent spaces. Were they temporary spaces? Were they more permanent? We know that there were brewers. Were they selling their beer out of their houses? And we don't know specifically. Like I said, I can tell you that there were brewers on Cook Street. I can tell you they were on Cavan Street. I can tell you they were on St. Patrick Street. I can tell you lots of places where they were, but specifically their locations, I can't tell you. Like it's at number 3. Like I don't have that. Yet maybe I will. Who knows?
You know what, we're going to invent time travel, right? Or someone will discover time travel. We'll go back, get photographic evidence, and then come back and give it.
Okay.
You're like, yeah, whatever.
That sounds fair.
I'm still on my first beer. I don't know where that came from. Sorry.
It sounds like an ideal solution, to be honest.
Yeah,
that would solve the problem. But then I guess you're asking like, is it, I'm not getting into it. There's too many questions. This question has more questions. I think that's the problem. There's so many questions within this question.
Okay. So we know that there's lots of questions, but if we kind of take a broad view and don't look at it too too technically. And if somebody was visiting from some other country and you were like, here, I'm going to bring you to the oldest pub in Dublin, it's like, what would you do?
I would take them to Brazen Head.
Okay.
I would take them to Brazen Head, and the reason why is because we have the earliest reference to the Brazen Head historically was in 1613. There was a fine given to Richard Fagan and his wife on the property on Bridge Street. So we know that there was, and it was called Brazen Head. So we know that there was.
The same name.
Yes, so that's why I'm saying that's the oldest reference, because it's the name, it's on Bridge Street. Is it exactly on that specific location? It doesn't say, but we can venture that it's somewhere around there, right? And it is a property on Bridge Street. And Timothy Dawson argued that it likely existed before 1613. It wasn't just didn't pop up there, and gave a date somewhere in the 16th century. So that does put Brazen Head somewhere, at least in the 16th century, called Brazen Head.
Right.
But is it a public house? No. You know, what was it back then? What was it doing? Because of course, 16th century, we wouldn't call it a public house.
Right.
So what specifically was it is another question, and how that functioned. And of course, I would read Timothy Dawson's study and his conclusions on what the space was and what it was used for, and those sorts of things. But yeah, so we do see reference to a place called the Brazen Head on Bridge Street in 1613. And again, it's when they're running afoul because it's a fine.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, so they could have someone across the road who was paying their taxes and doing their, what did you call it, your toll bowl and everything, and they're just not in the records.
Well, they wouldn't be paying the toll bill anymore in 1613 because this was after the dissolution of the monasteries. So that's all gone now.
So it's the crown now is in charge.
Yeah, it's all in secular hands. Or Church of England hands. But mostly secular. So yeah, that's a non-starter at that point, but there are other sorts of tithes and fees, and in other places in Ireland there's taxes on ale or malt that helped build the walls of the city for defensive purposes, and paid for wars and things like that. So like tax on ale or brewing or brewing equipment is quite common within sort of the English ruling their laws and their taxes and these sorts of things. So that is a thing. But yeah.
I'm going to the Midlands Craft Beer Festival in August, and I'm stopping by in Athlone, and I'm going to a bar that's commonly touted as the oldest pub in Ireland. And I said this to my mom, and she said, oh, like, I thought the Brazen Head was, you took me to the Brazen Head. And like, I live across the river from this pub, and that's what, the sign says on the door. So maybe there's a sort of friendly rivalry amongst the two places. But I would say those are maybe the most common two that are publicly represented at this time. And
they did go head to head on the public airways at some stage to do a very I don't know how in depth they went into their analysis, and they went to public arbitration.
Did they? Well, and then I know, like, I guess it was the certified, which I'm putting again in giant air quotes for everyone just listening, by Guinness, but the Book of World Records arm, not the brewing arm. So again, you're already in the realm of they're not scientists, they're not here to do that kind of thing. They have a very specific frame of reference that they're using. So again, it is what it is.
Yeah, and this is the thing with like the oldest pub kind of all over the world. Like this is a problematic question. There's lots of questions within the question. Like I said, I'm not going to touch base on anything in the negative specifically, right, but do be wary of, just keep an open mind and have, challenge those things in your head and have a think, okay, what is this based on? Why are they arguing that? Dig around a bit and see what you can find. And it's not to say that the places aren't very old. I mean, a lot of them are very old, but look at kind of the history and maybe the archaeology and see, okay, well, this is maybe is what the archaeology is really saying, or maybe, oh, this is what the archaeology is really saying. Dig into those claims a little bit. But like I said, I'm not going to comment on anything specifically.
Yeah, and I think just to again look at some of the ones, because again this comes up in England, this comes up in Germany, anywhere, Belgium, I'm sure as well. Like it's again, these things shift all of the time in terms of how they're defining themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you can go to all of these places and just enjoy digging around, having a couple drinks. At the end of the day, are they keeping their tap lines clean? Are they, providing good service now? Let's maybe grade them on their current hospitality offerings while enjoying whatever kind of historical, we'll say, patina they may or may not have.
Well, and the thing is after we get, so for example, I'm really hoping once these reconstructed documents from the 1922 fire come in, we could have a lot of older references. We could know a lot more than we know now. Like we could have way earlier references for some of these pubs than what we have found so far. So this could completely change. So as a historian, I'm really only comfortable with doing what I can see in the primary sources. Well, a historian and archaeologist. So I like to put the two together. So I want to kind of see them together. And I'm really more comfortable with going with what the primary sources say and how maybe that looks with the archaeology. There might be an argument for earlier things just based on the archaeology. Okay, but the history says this is the earliest. Okay, maybe I'm going to go with this. So you kind of have to combine them. But like I said, this 1922 fire reconstructed documents might come and just blow that all out the water. We might be like, oh, okay, actually, here's one 300 years before that. We don't know yet. So yeah.
And I think in the meantime, it is kind of fun, like to look at the interior and the exterior architecture and just kind of play with it and immerse yourself and look at the photos that they have and, not take it super seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of them are so much fun to visit. Like Katie, like you were saying, like Keitler's Inn, like each of those little rooms is sort of different and fun and just like, they're leaning into it. And of course, lean into it. It's great. It's fantastic. Or yeah, like Brazen Head, you can go from kind of room to room. They're all a little bit different. And it's just nice that you can go somewhere and kind of have a different experience depending on just where you happen to be sitting in the pub. And I think that counts for something too.
And like, I think it's really cool that the Brazen Head reference in 1613, it is the Brazen Head. So that's why I'm saying that's the one I would choose, because it's literally, it's called the thing. So that, but again, that could change. That could change.
There's a whole separate thing we'd have to do another episode on another time on, like when all Irish pubs have to start putting the proprietor's name in the name, because that sort of obfuscates a lot of history in some cases and creates new in others. And that's a whole separate thing, but it's a topic well worth kind of deep diving into, because it makes it hard to find places like the Brazen Head or that have these kind of easy to remember names versus, O'Neill's or, whomever's name is above the door. So
yeah, and there's lots of drama with massive breweries owning public houses and how that impacts other places because they can do X, Y, and Z. And so and then the Industrial Revolution. And so there's lots and lots of layers to this. But basically the question of what's the oldest pub in Ireland it's not the question I think people want the answer to. I think they want to know, what is the oldest place I could buy a beer and drink it in public? And maybe not buy it, but be served it and drink it in public. That is still in continuous use. And that's a different question.
Absolutely. And again, and then there's a whole argument there for, getting a bag of cans and sitting in the old, former Viking roads, streets that are now under all those terrible modern buildings. But hey, that's continuous use, right? So there you go.
Yeah,
I'm with you on that. I'm over here.
Head out where past where the old city walls were down Francis Street to where the fairgrounds were, and it's basically just sidewalk, but hey, have a can. Imagine you're at a medieval festival. I mean, that might be illegal, so probably don't do that, but yeah.
I believe
No access.
The Christchurch Cathedral crypts are able to host wedding receptions, so there you go.
Yeah.
There you
And
go.
then they do mention them being in and out of both official and unofficial use as pubs and clubs. Again, pubs in air quotes, clubs. If you do the ghost walk, they stop there because there is also a Hellfire Club connection, because of course there is, maybe. But you know, these things are all a little fungible. Might have been nearby, might have been there.
I think it was like all of a boys' network, like the Hellfire Club and Leinster House, and where all the boys hung out, you know. So they're all linked.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think that there's a big, a really important takeaway there. Basically, sort of 17th, 18th century, you could have been drinking everywhere if you were a dude of a certain class. So you know, those places are still there in a lot of cases, the ones that weren't knocked down by the Wide Streets Commission. But you know, just think of these things that happen to repurpose as like wedding venues. Exactly that.
Yeah.
It's a journey.
It is.
Definitely. And I think I'm thinking of a different episode where we can do like the somethingest pub in Ireland or the world, you know?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily oldest. Like we have quite famous pubs that say they're the highest pub in Ireland or the lowest or the nearest.
That is much more definable. And
it is.
The biggest.
Absolutely.
You can be kind of objective about that.
Yeah. There's a pub quite close to me, and I'm not sure how true this is, but they claim to be the nearest pub in Ireland to New York.
Maybe. I mean,
that's fair.
It could be. Yeah, we're further west than the Aran Islands, but I'm wondering, is there somewhere down in Kerry that might beat them? I don't know.
I love the trying to find your very niche like claim to fame, as it were.
Yeah.
I'm really here for that. I really like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to see more of that. Things that aren't even like where it's not quite a theme pub as such, but there's something that's really unique that they just go into, like the Tom Crean, you know, stuff. I love that there's like polar exploration. This is our thing now. It's like, great, I love it. There's a real tie-in, and it's just cool to see something like that is unique. Again, that's not the most blah, but it's just something that is, you know, that helps it, you know, set it apart, and it just, you know, gives it that little bit of historical interest. So here for it.
Yeah.
I also like the silly ones that are like on this spot in 1435, nothing happened.
Yeah.
Just find, I
You're
think
like,
those
"I'll
things are
drink
rather
that."
silly. Yeah. Well, I mean, something did. Someone probably walked past it at some point, but yeah.
And it's not like best pub where it's like so ridiculously subjective that no one could ever answer it. So yeah, like
find your silly niche thing, like the most ridiculous thing you can find. I love that. I think that's cool.
I love a good gimmick, like I will admit.
For sure. And you don't even need to spend that much time with it, but just like little things like that, like what you said, Katie. I would go to that pub because I think that's funny.
Yeah. And if that's on your t-shirt and whatnot, like that's great. I love that. It just gives it a talking point. You know, it's adorable.
Yeah.
I do love that. I do love that. But yeah, so I will put in the comments like links to some of these studies that I was talking about, because of course I'm a beer historian, so I come across pubs and ale houses in my research, but I am not focused on pubs and ale houses in my research. So I will send you on to experts. You can read their studies. Yeah, and hopefully these 1922 papers reveal some really cool things for us.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
And Christina, I'm in awe of all your knowledge. I learned so much on this.
Yeah, well, a lot of this is coming from my books, so you'll have to read more of it there.
Buy her book.
I will buy your book. I will buy your book, Christina.
Oh yeah, well now I'm adding all this 1922 stuff. So
yeah, and this is why we don't want to make anyone mad, because we need to think of a good place to have a launch party for your book when it's time. You know, do a signing, all of that. So we got to be in everyone's good graces. So
but
we love you all.
But I should say before the book, I will be starting beer history tours of Dublin. So that will be coming either June or July. It's definitely going to be June or July, probably July. Once a month on a Saturday, 11 o'clock ish, we're going to go.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you can come to that in the meantime.
I will be there for a walking tour. I'll be there for a book reading, like here to support all your teachings. And
You guys
thank
are
you.
so nice to me. Thank you for listening. It's so nice to have someone to nerd out about this stuff with.
Yeah, and I think for anyone who's listening, if you guys want to go start a flame war on Twitter with any individual establishments, up to you. You guys do you. It's not us. So
Yes,
just
do not drag me into it, because I will not comment on specific pubs.
Yep, exactly. You guys can do it, but we sit that out.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Have we come to our natural conclusion there? Or have we any other points that we want to go through? Or
No, I think I'm good.
I think we're good. I'm really curious to see what other people think about it. So that'll be the fun thing to observe. And again, and I say observe with a capital O. So yeah.
Yeah, we're don't drag us into this. All right, so friends, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and thank you again for supporting us so much. And remember to check us out on YouTube and socials, wherever you get your podcast. So thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.